greatest prize in any sport is the end of the season championship, whether we're talking about the Super Bowl and the Lombardi Trophy, the NBA Finals, or the Stanley Cup. The championship is the culmination of months of struggle and years of preparation. NASCAR isn't any different, and with the longest season of any American sport, you can bet that whoever lifts the cup at season's end is more than worthy of the title of NASCAR Cup Series champion. But some of the greatest drivers of all time could never put it all together for a single season and take the top ranking. Sometimes it was just a matter of being good while others were great, or maybe they just never bothered to run a full season, and then other times some guys just called it quits and moved on. Whatever the case may be, today we take a look at the best of the rest, the greatest drivers to never win a Cup Series title. To make this list, there are only two rules. You have to have never won a title in the top division, and that you must be currently retired from the Cup Series with no prospect of coming back in the near future. So without further ado, let's get into this. Number 10, Jim Paschal. Having a career that spanned from NASCAR's very first race ever held in 1949 all the way until the modern era began in 1972, Jim Paschal saw the sport morph from primitive races on tiny dirt tracks all the way to the big 500-mile crown jewel events on paved superspeedways. As such, he became quite adept at all disciplines of racing in the Grand National Division. He won a grand total of 25 races across 421 starts, and although he'd find his greatest success on the short tracks, netting an average finish of 11th on those tracks across his entire career, he's most well known for his accomplishments on the big tracks. He won the World 600 at the Charlotte Motor Speedway twice, and at that second win in 1967, he did so by leading 335 of 400 laps, a record that would stand until Martin Truex Jr. shattered it in 2016 by leading 392 laps. He competed full-time throughout most of his career, doing quite well in the point standings and ended up with 10 top 10 points finishes. He only got one top 5 points finish in his career, and although he competed full-time to the best of his abilities during the 50s and 60s, the monstrous schedule was just too much for him, and he could rarely make it to as many events as some of the other drivers. Thus his points total suffered and he never captured the cup. Number 9, Fred Lorenzen. Fearless Freddie from Elmhurst, Illinois, had a career in NASCAR's top division that spanned from 1956 until 1972. During that time, he never really made an attempt to run a full season. As a matter of fact, he only ran more than half of the races in a given season once in 1963, when he entered 29 in 55 races that year. But even considering that, he managed to finish third in the points that year. He only started 158 races during his entire career, but won 26 times, giving him a staggering win percentage of 16.5%. He won the 1965 Daytona 500, and although he avoided dirt tracks like the plague, he had just as much success on short tracks as he did on the big tracks, with wins at Martinsville, Augusta, Bristol, Charlotte, Atlanta, and Rockingham, among others. He's perhaps best known for the car he drove in the 1966 Atlanta race, in which his car owner Junior Johnson was tasked with coaxing Ford back into NASCAR after they had boycotted much of the season due to new rule changes. NASCAR had essentially told Junior and Ford that whatever kind of car they entered into the race, it would pass tech inspection. Junior took this and ran with it as far as he could. The roof had been chopped short several inches, the front windshield had been significantly sloped to make it more aerodynamic, the front end sloped downward, and the rear of the vehicle curved upward so the trunk would act as one gigantic spoiler. And the man he picked to drive it? Well, none other than Fearless Freddie. Even Lorenzen himself thought it was a bit much, but when you're handed a car that is pretty much guaranteed to win, you don't exactly say no thank you. That number 26 Ford Galaxy was derogatorily called the banana car by rival drivers because of its shape. The car was bad fast, and although Lorenzen could wheel it to the lead, it was incredibly unstable, and he'd wreck out at the halfway mark. Karma's a bitch, I guess. Number 8, Ricky Rudd. Holding the record for most starts ever in the modern era at 906, Rudd's career spans from 1975 to 2007. During this time, he had an insane stretch of seasons with at least one win that spanned from 1983 to 1998. And all in all, he netted 23 wins, which came on an even mix of speedways and short tracks, and he even won the Brickyard 400 in 1997. There was no doubt that Rudd could get everything out of his equipment, and his true talents could be found on the road courses. He scored 6 wins at those tracks, with 2 each coming at Riverside, Sonoma, and Watkins Glen. And broadcasters even had him pioneer the foot cam where people at home could see his fancy footwork behind the wheel, where sometimes he would mash all 3 pedals at once using an absurd heel-toe technique that was almost as entertaining as the race itself. Ricky Rudd was NASCAR's Iron Man and did not miss a race from 1981 until 2006, and the only reason he didn't make a start in 2006 was because he couldn't find a ride, although he did swap out for an ill Tony Stewart at Dover that year. He went full-time again in 2007 with Robert Yates Racing, and then called it a career after that. He was easily one of the most stubborn and determined drivers around, and even injuries never stopped him. One time after a horrifying flip at Daytona in 1984 in the Clash, his face was swollen so bad from the G-forces he sustained that he could hardly see. So when the qualifying races came around just 4 days later, he duct taped his eyes open. Even though his win total is less than the previous 2 entries, his overall stats tell a different story. Across his mammoth career, he finished in the top 10 in points a staggering 19 times from 1979 until 2002. He started a lot more races but was ridiculously consistent week in and week out for decades, and that more than makes him worthy of number 8 on this list. For number 7, I'm going to hand it off to a guy who knows a thing or two about missing rings, the Iceberg. Jarrett, take it away.
Thanks, Slap. At number 7, we have Dale Earnhardt Jr., NASCAR's most popular driver for a staggering 15 straight years in NASCAR's most popular era. But fame wasn't only from a name, as Jr. came right out of the gate, winning almost immediately. From his rookie year in 2000 through 2004, Jr. won 15 times. Only 2 drivers won more in that span, Jeff Gordon 20 times and Tony Stewart 16. At this time, he also raced for Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, the team his father built. While he ran up front at DEI, the team as a whole was a mid-pack team, and from 2005 to 2007, he would fall back to the team's mean, only scoring 2 wins in the midst of a nasty split between he and stepmother Teresa Earnhardt, the team's owner. Junior's free agency landed him with Hendrick Motorsports. After a fuel mileage win at Michigan in 2008, Earnhardt hit an all-time career low, going winless for 4 straight seasons. Little did anyone know that this would lead to one of the greatest career resurgences in NASCAR history. 2012 to 2015 would prove to be the most consistent streak of his career. In those 4 years, he won 8 times with 48 top 5s, 84 top 10s, and 3 seasons finishing 8th or higher in the points. 2015 tied his career high in top 5s from 2004 with 16, and both 2013 and 2015 set career highs with 22 top 10s. What ended up being Junior's Achilles heel would be concussions. From 1998 on, his career was plagued with injuries that stacked up over time and caused him to miss 2 races in 2012, half of the 2016 season, and retire after the 2017 season. While Junior never had seasons that came just short like a lot of others on the list, he was a semi-regular championship level driver, and in years like 2003, 04, 06, as well as 2012 to 2015, he was always in the hunt. Add to this his 2 Xfinity titles and 26 career victories, and you have one of the best drivers to never win a Cup championship. Now, with all that being said, I'll flip it back over to you, Slap.
Appreciate it, Jarrett. Thanks for all your hard work, man. Number 6, Carl Edwards. Having one of the shortest careers on this list, Carl Edwards began racing full-time in the Cup Series in 2005 and won 4 times in his first campaign. But as would be a trend with him, he'd falter the next season and go winless. He bounced back in 2007, winning 3 times, and would have his first runner-up points finish the following year, in which he won 9 races, but came up short in the chase to Jimmy Johnson. He'd go winless again in 2009, but in 2011 he had the second rebound of his career and had a massive points lead, only to have Tony Stewart take advantage of a points reset in the chase and win 5 of the last 10 races to tie the points with Edwards, and won the tiebreaker by having more wins on the season. But surely in 2016, having 3 wins on the year and leading during the last race of the season on a late race restart, he could wrap it all up this time, right? Nope, not that time either. After that third gut-wrenching championship shortcoming, Carl Edwards called it quits in his prime, and said no thanks to any future endeavors in the sport. He has not made a start in any NASCAR division since. The victim of an ever-changing points format, Carl would always have to wonder what if. Now, had the point system remained the same old year-end points total system from the Winston Cup days, then Cousin Carl would have 2 titles to his name, but unfortunately it was just never meant to be. Across 12 full-time seasons, he finished top 10 in the point standings 8 times, and top 5 6 times, with a grand total of 28 race wins. He was consistently a threat to win the title year in and year out, but after so many touch-and-go seasons, he just decided it was better to bow out. Number 5, Fireball Roberts. With a nickname like Fireball, you had better be pretty darn good, and Edward Glenn Roberts was most certainly one of the greatest of all time. He finished runner-up in the point standings in just his first season in 1950, despite only running 9 of 19 events, and he won 33 races in just 206 starts. He would make several attempts at putting together a full-time season, But as per usual during the 50s and 60s, full-time rides were hard to come by, and it was oftentimes just too logistically demanding to get from one race to the other back in the day, with 2 or 3 races happening per week across a 45, 55, or even 60 race schedule. Even still, Fireball amassed 6 top 10 points finishes from 1950 to 1963. He won the Daytona 500 in 1962 and had just as much success on dirt as he did on asphalt. In 1964, he was already putting together a respectable season as he had just notched his first win of the year at Augusta. But in the World 600, he wrecked on the backstretch while trying to avoid a tangle between Ned Jarrett and Junior Johnson. His car hit the inside wall trunk first, flipped, and immediately caught fire. He was trapped inside and was severely burned. Several weeks later, he would succumb to his injuries. He was just 35 years old. His death was not in vain, though, as NASCAR would implement several new safety regulations, which included mandated fireproof coveralls for drivers and self-sealing fuel tanks. Had he never been involved in that terrible wreck in Charlotte, he would have no doubt added to his already impressive legacy and maybe even gotten that first title. Number 4, Davey Allison. Another driver whose life was tragically cut short in his prime, Davey Allison was poised to take the NASCAR world by storm. And by all accounts, he had pretty much already done so by the time the 90s rolled around. Despite having only run 6 full-time seasons and 191 total starts, he amassed 19 wins, a Daytona 500 crown, and 3 top 10 points finishes. In just his final 2 full-time seasons alone in 1991 and 1992, he scored 10 wins and finished 3rd in the points back-to-back. And as we all know by now, he was the odds-on favorite to win the title going to the final race of the year in 1992. But fate had other plans. He had wins at intermediate tracks and short tracks, and only netted 1 road course win at Sonoma in 1991, albeit under dubious circumstances. But his real strength was at the superspeedways. With Robert Yates horsepower under the hood, Talladega, Michigan, and Daytona were his playgrounds. If you wanted to win at those venues, you were either going to have to get gutsy with your pit strategy, or just hope the Alabama gang goofed that day. The son of NASCAR royalty Bobby Allison, Davey was no doubt going to grow far beyond his father's shadow. And had he not died in that helicopter crash in 1993, who knows how many titles and wins he would have stolen from the likes of Jeff Gordon, Dale Earnhardt, and others. The NASCAR record books were forever altered after his passing. We never got to see his full potential, but it would have no doubt been legendary. Number 3, Curtis Turner. NASCAR's founder Big Bill France said of Curtis Turner, quote, "He was the greatest race car driver I ever saw." And he lived up to the hype too, winning on all manner of tracks, from small dirt ovals to paved superspeedways. He won the pole for the inaugural Southern 500 and was a fan favorite for most of his tenure in the sport. So why didn't he ever bring home the title? Well, as we've talked about, running full-time back then was just kind of unheard of. But the biggest reason? In 1961, he was banned from NASCAR for life for trying to start up a drivers' union. Just when full-time Grand National competition was starting to become a reality for many drivers, Curtis Turner got the axe because he wanted a cut of broadcasting rights revenue. He languished for 4 years in the smaller promotions, just trying to eke out a living racing stock cars. But in 1965, after NASCAR saw its biggest star, Richard Petty, turn his attention to drag racing, and Ford and Chrysler Corp boycotted NASCAR over some engine disagreements, Big Bill was looking for some reason, any reason to get people to show up to his races. So that year he lifted the ban, and Curtis won for the first time since 1959, in one of the greatest comeback arcs in NASCAR history. It would prove to be his last win in the Cup Series. He ended his career with 17 wins and 184 starts, and a litany of wins in the lower divisions. Big Bill said he was the best, but if only he had let him prove it to us. So number 1 on this list is obviously going to be Mark Martin. So really the only question left is who's going to take home the number 2 slot. And that man is none other than Mark Martin. Yep, Mark Martin, the eternal bridesmaid, comes up second even on this list. I think there was one other driver who was better. Before we get into who that is though, let's give Mark his fair shake. Bursting onto the scene in the early 80s, Mark showed a lot of promise, but sponsorship woes would put a damper on his early career. He raced sporadically throughout the mid-80s until Jack Roush came knocking in 1988, and he got his first win just a year later. After that, the rest was history. He'd net 35 wins and 4 runner-up points finishes with Roush Racing, and in 2007 would go part-time as he eyed retirement. But the racing bug wasn't fully out of his system yet, and when Rick Hendrick offered him a full-time multi-year contract for his flagship number 5 car in 2009, Mark could not pass it up. He'd get 5 more wins, another championship runner-up, and would go part-time again in 2012. In 2013, he'd make his final starts and call it a career. With nearly 100 wins in the top 3 divisions, and not a single championship to show for it in any of them, it's honestly a miracle he didn't walk away with the top ranking at year's end just by sheer accident. He had 17 top 10 points finishes in the Cup Series, which included 13 top 5 points finishes. Of those, 7 were in a row from 1993 to 1999. The streak was only broken by an 8th place points finish in 2000. If anyone could ever claim the title of Mr. Consistency, it is Mark Martin. He is far and away one of the best to never wear the crown. So who was the guy who edged out Mark Martin? Who in the world was better than him but never won a cup? Well, that honor goes to the last American hero himself. Number 1, Junior Johnson. Junior Johnson was one of the most cheatingest car owners in NASCAR history and won 6 championships as a car owner but not one as a driver, despite winning 50 races in his career behind the wheel, including the 1960 Daytona 500 where he famously discovered the properties of drafting. Now you might say, hey, things were different back then, they were racing 2 or 3 times a week, you can't really count that compared to Mark's 40 wins. But it should be noted that Junior Johnson got his 50 wins in just 313 starts, as opposed to Mark's 882. Yeah, they ran a lot of races back then, but Mark started more than 2.5 times more races than Junior in his career. Junior's attempts at a full-time season were also marred by lack of rides and logistical problems, so he never really got the points finishes he probably deserved. He drove for a litany of different owners, but his true talents were made obvious when he prepared his own cars. Taking his cues from the old breed of owners like Cotton Owens and Smokey Yunick, Junior Johnson maneuvered his way around the rules with expert precision, and eventually found his true calling. Once he made the switch to being a car owner, the cup started rolling in and the wins just piled up, and he solidified his position on the top of this list. So there it is, my take on the top 10 drivers to never win a Cup Series title. I'd like to give a big shout out to the Iceberg for making this collaboration happen, and a huge thanks to Biodegradable, who edited this video for me while I've been busy at work. Links to their pages in the description down below and in the pinned comment. Until next time, y'all take it easy.